Our guest today is Professor Robert Lucas, Nobel Prize in Economics in 1995 and one of the most distinguished thinkers in this field in the last 40 years. He is professor in economics at the University of Chicago, where he has been teaching since 1974. Professor Lucas is widely known by his research in macroeconomic analysis and also in developing the rational expectation theory. His research also is related with economic growth, financial and monetary policies. Good morning, Professor Lucas. It's a great pleasure having you with us today. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you to Galicia. Welcome to Fundación Barrier, and thank you for dedicating some minutes to join us.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be in this beautiful, beautiful part of the country.
Okay, let me begin with the general aspect of the crisis, of the current crisis. You and many other economists have talked about the parallelisms between the crisis in the 30s and the current crisis. The crisis had a financial component since the very beginning. What do you think we should have learned about it? I mean, what's the key lesson in relation with the financial side of the crisis?
Well, there are several. One question is, how do you set up a financial system that's not subject to runs? That's a hard problem. I think there was legislation in the 1930s, the so-called Glass-Steagall Act, addressed that issue in a constructive way, but not in a permanently successful way, as we know. And I'm not quite sure what other legislation should be adopted now. Now, the second issue is, once a crisis occurs, what's the appropriate response for the central bank? And this is what people talk, is the issue of what are the responsibilities of a central bank to be a lender of last resort? Now, in the 1930s, the Federal Reserve System did nothing to deal with the crisis. They simply didn't perform the function of a lender of last resort. And I think that was a huge factor in the depth of that recession. In 2008, the central bank acted very rapidly, very decisively, and dealt with the liquidity problem right away, in a matter of a quarter. So in that sense, I think Bernanke, and he said this, had learned a lesson from the failure of the 1930s and resolved not to repeat it, and we didn't repeat it. So I think that was a very constructive thing. It's a different issue from the question of how do we stop this from happening again, but that's a harder question, and it takes different, we'd have to discuss that separately. So I think in that sense, the Fed has learned a lot, and I'm glad they did.
Talking about the way in which governments fought the crisis, do you think it was a proper response to bail out some financial institution under the too big to fail policy?
Well, that's a good question, and it's exactly the question that a good regulation system has to deal with, and I don't believe we have so far. So let me just talk about it. With hindsight, it was too bad that we didn't bail out Lehman Brothers, and it was correct to intervene at that point. I mean, at some point, the systemic consequences of these failures, you just can't sit by and watch it happen. It's true that if we were willing to do that, it would set up good incentives for banks to be a lot more careful of where they invest their funds. But it's too expensive a lesson to put an entire economy through a depression, and we're never going to be willing to do it. And in some sense, I don't think we should be willing to do it. So the issue is, I'm drawn to what people call a Bagehot rule. Bagehot was a financial journalist in the 19th century in England who said that the lender of last resort, and that's what we're talking about, should lend against good collateral at penalty rates. So you're not lending to people who what's the point of Bagehot's rule? You let a irresponsible bank go under, but you're assuring other banks which have been more responsible, that you'll be there for them if the run hits them. And a bank run is a contagious thing. It hits companies that in some sense deserve it, and it hits companies that in no sense deserve it. And the lender of last resort has to do something to stop that contagion. But the way to do it is I think, is to try to do it in a way that it doesn't just say you're too big, does better than too big to fail. You got to let some banks fail, we haven't figured out how to do that just yet. Alan Meltzer, who's a historian of the Federal Reserve System, says the Federal Reserve has never spelled out what their policy is on lender of last resort. You know, so I think until that's done, banks are not going to know where they stand.
And reforming the financial markets, the regulation and the supervision mechanisms are now on the international agenda. What do you consider is more important in this sense? To strengthen the regulation, to reforming some institutions, or maybe improving the cooperation mechanisms?
I don't think maybe America's just too big a country, but I find it hard to think of international cooperations as something from an American point of view matters very much. The supervision, the regulation that's embodied in the new act, this 1,000-page legislation, this Dodd-Frank bill, it uses thousands of regulations, but they don't seem to be aimed at the important issues. In particular, this too big to fail issue. They don't really address that issue. So everything depends on the nature of the regulations, and I don't think we've come up with 1,000 pages of legislation, but I don't think we've come up with an answer to that question that's going to help.
Maybe through international mechanisms of cooperation between institutions. I mean, it's possible to reach a commitment to have coordinated responses to this kind of situations, or it's quite impossible.
Well, I guess a case in point would be the ECB's decision to lend to Greece. That was not something that was written in to the charter of the ECB. It's something that many people thought the ECB would never do, and many people are puzzled as to why they felt needed to step in. So if that's an example of international cooperation, that everybody in Europe is going to be responsible for poor government in one country, I think that's a dangerous precedent. It's not working in the right direction.
The European Union is proposing now some governance rules in relation with the Stability and Growth Pact, and also the creation of some taxes on financial activity and transactions. What do you think about this kind of proposals?
There's been a lot of innovation in the financial industry in the last decades. A lot of it's been very constructive. It's technical issues. It doesn't seem to me. I don't see the constructive role that regulation is going to have. Let's suppose regulators had to be involved when people were creating the securitized mortgages back in the 80s in the States. I mean, that was a hugely constructive thing. I don't see how we could have financed the housing construction that's gone on since the 80s without this kind of securitization. It broke the connection between individual local banks bearing all the risk for what's going on in their areas and made it a national issue. I think it was great. And I think if you had to pass that through some some test regulators, I don't know what would happen with that. In general, I guess, I want to have the burden of proof to, if somebody who thinks government can come in and tell private firms what they ought to do, they ought to have the burden of proof ought to be on them to show that they know how to do it better. I think that would be hard to do. It certainly hasn't been done with the Dodd-Frank bill.
We were talking about the financial side of the crisis, but the crisis went beyond this field and impacted directly on the economic growth, on the unemployment, and more recently in the national budget deficits and public debt. So, do you think we have reached the bottom of the crisis?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we thought that it occurred in 2009, and it's been up and down since. There's no real movement toward getting back to the old trend line. And that too has got some precedent in the 1930s. That the we've talked about the 1933 Banking Act, which in some sense resolved the financial crisis in the United States at that time. But it wasn't until 1942, after the United States was involved in World War II, that unemployment got back to under 10%. And for us, 10% is a big number. Maybe Spain has gotten used to 20%, but we haven't. And so it took a long time, and it's the same question of this slow recovery is now coming back to us in the present situation. So it's a concern. I have it too. We should have a concern.
And what can governments and financial institutions do to boost the recovery?
Well, people are on all sides of that issue in the States. A lot of people think the government's got to go in with another stimulus package, a bigger one, put more money into the system. A lot of people, myself included, think that the first stimulus bill didn't add to anything much except for the deficit, which got bigger. So that this didn't seem to be, I don't see why we want to repeat that or enlarge that move. What I think would be constructive would be, I mean, the private sector is going to have, right now people are not investing. You know, business investment is just at rock bottom, and consumer demand for durable goods and it's not recovering, and that's what's going on in the States. So it seems to me the solution has got to be that something's going to happen to make firms and individuals think it's a good time to do some investing, to start some new projects. Now, how's that going to come about? Well, you know, it's hard to say, because if nobody else is investing, then maybe I don't want to invest either. So there's a kind of coordination issue. But basically, people are going to have to feel that if they put their money into some new initiative, firms are going to have to feel it, and that initiative succeeds. Of course, some initiatives turn out to be disappointing. It succeeds and brings in some, products that people want to buy. Then that's going to be, it's not going to be all taxed away. It's not going to be regulated away. You know, you got to have the feeling that taking a risk and making an investment, you're going to get a decent return out of it. Otherwise, and that's just the basic economics. And I don't think in the States, it's not that people can't borrow from the bank. Nobody wants to borrow from the bank. People don't want to take these risks right now. They don't know what the tax structure is going to look like, the personal tax structure, the business tax structure. They don't know what kind of future they're going to be living in, and I think that's very damaging. I think it would be huge if some assurances could be given. And all this talk about taxing the rich and so on, well, if that's what they're going to do, then I guess I don't particularly want to try and get rich.
Okay, Professor Lucas, thank you very much for sharing your opinions and your experience with us. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's a lot of fun talking to people who care about the world's problems.
Thank you.